research operated by the U.S. Department of Energy. At Jefferson Lab, scientists can advance our understanding of matter itself by probing quarks and gluons in the atom's nucleus with beams of electrons from the superconducting accelerator. Jefferson Lab has an educational mission as well. The Jefferson Lab Science Series features scientists and engineers who are gifted in making their work not only informative but fun. The Science Series is held once a month in the Jefferson Lab Auditorium. The presentation is live, spontaneous, and unrehearsed.
Evening. We'd like to welcome you to the first of our spring science series at Jefferson Lab. We invite you to pick up this little blue sheet where you'll see that we've got 3 additional exciting lectures for you to come to or watch on tape on various exciting forms of science, including the physics of baseball, physics of drama, or the drama of physics, and Einstein's Unfinished Symphony. So we invite you back the rest of the spring semester. But tonight we have a treat for you. Dr. Richard Williams comes to us from 2 venerable scientific institutions, the U.S. Geological Survey and the National Geographic Society. We're very proud of Jefferson Lab being here 15 years, and the Department of Energy going back to the Atomic Energy Commission in the late 40s. But you can trace the Geological Survey back to this nation's first scientific expedition, which Messrs. Lewis and Clark did, funded by Mr. Jefferson, which we fondly refer to in this state as Mr. Jefferson still. And the National Geographic Society has also been around for more than a century, funding very good science that you read about in their excellent magazine and their television shows. Dr. Williams has undergraduate and master's degrees from University of Michigan and a PhD from Penn State in geophysics. And for the last 38 years, he has been studying problems that we all read about every day, almost every day, in newspapers and magazines. The problem of global warming. Is there global warming? What causes it? What should we do about it? Very complicated, controversial subject. You can find many expert opinions on all sides of this case. We were treated to a lecture on that earlier this afternoon. But Dr. Williams' talk tonight has something to do about a very interesting place on the globe, a little island called Iceland, which is an island of fire and an island of a lot of ice. And the contrast between those extremes lends for very interesting geophysics and the science of what makes the Earth tick. And so I'd like to stand aside and let Dr. Williams tell you about Iceland.
Thank you very much, Fred, for the very nice introduction. Notice it was extemporaneous, too. He's got a good memory. And I wish to thank him and Linda Ware. Linda gave me a wonderful tour of the laboratory on some of the handiwork of my son's father-in-law. It's this great institution, which has a budget, by the way, is about the same as the U.S. Geological Survey, which has 10,000 employees nationwide. This evening, I would like to introduce you, those of you who don't. How many of you actually been to Iceland? Well, we've got 3 people in the audience. Good. This will be a real treat for the rest of you and also those of you who have been to Iceland. What I'm going to do is give you kind of an overview of the geology of Iceland, the geography of Iceland, a little bit about the culture. It's one of the Earth's most interesting countries. There are about 220 nations on the globe, and Iceland is one of the smaller ones in terms of population, 280,000, about 1,000th the size of the United States. But what characterizes Iceland is, and most interesting, is that it's a land of tremendous contrasts and dynamic activity in terms of the Earth system. in terms of the frozen component, the cryosphere, the glaciers, the volcanoes, and the changing biosphere, the impact of humans on Iceland. I'm going to try to introduce you to a lot of these aspects of Iceland. It's all compacted into a very small area, so we can visit a lot of sites in Iceland quickly. I guess if we can turn down the lights a little more, probably be better for the slides. Oh, you got to have lights for the cameras, but not for the overhead. Where is Iceland? Well, Iceland isn't that far away, actually. Out of Baltimore, it's about a 4-hour flight. Flies frequently to Iceland. It's an island in the North Atlantic. It's between Greenland, the ice covered the ice sheet of Greenland, the United Kingdom, Ireland, and not too far from Norway. Norway, of course, and the Hebrides, Ireland, Isle of Man is where the original settlers of Iceland came from. They came in 874 for the first time, and in about 50 years it pretty much settled Iceland. From Iceland, some of the earlier settlers, 10 years later, Eric the Red journeyed over to southern Greenland, the western side, formed several settlements that lasted for 400 or 500 years until the climate did them in. And they also explored a fair area of northeastern North America, of which the most famous settlement site that's been excavated is Lonso Meadows in northern Newfoundland, which was occupied about the year 1000. So even though it's a tiny land, the people do get around. That was essentially the way Iceland looks as we would see it, but of course it's sitting on a platform. It's a completely volcanic island, about 15 million years old geologically, and it sits on a very wide platform, and of course the EEZ, the Exclusive Economic Zone, even increases its size even more so out to the 200 nautical mile limit. But Iceland is much larger if you look at it from this viewpoint. Its total area is about 103,000 square kilometers, about 440,000 square miles, essentially the same size as the Commonwealth of Virginia. It sits on the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, which we see this fractured ridge coming up into the southern part of Iceland with Surtsey, which we'll see in a moment. Then it continues north along the Kolbeinsey Ridge. And there's also a ridge that goes between Greenland and the Faroe Islands. And so it sort of sits on two major sort of weaknesses in the Earth's crust, which is why we have so much volcanic activity. Well, that's a good one. Oh, there we go. Iceland, this is a composite of Landsat images of Iceland, in other words, a mosaic. So you get a very good look at what the island looks like in terms of where the vegetation is, shown here in green. Most of it's around the periphery. The grayer areas are essentially deserts. Most of the population lives here in Reykjavik, about 150,000 people. And the rest are scattered in communities around Iceland, Akureyri up here in Eyjafjörður. When you go to Iceland, you land at an airport out here at Keflavik. There's some interesting areas in Iceland that we'll see, like Snæfellsnes. Snæfellsnes was where Jules Verne's story, Journey to the Center of the Earth, began, and in Mount Etna in Italy. The white areas we see on here, which we'll look at in more detail in a few minutes, are the ice caps of Iceland. They cover about 11% of the area of Iceland. And underneath this ice cap here and the western part of the Vatnajökull ice cap are active volcanoes. So we have the interaction of volcanism and glacier ice. We also have, in this part of Iceland in particular, a lot of geothermal activity. The city of Reykjavik is completely heated. All the homes, public buildings, what have you, are heated by geothermal water, which comes from outside the city through aqueducts and also from underneath the city. About $15 a month for heating the homes. There are swimming pools all over Reykjavik. And many Icelanders swim every day of the year, including the winter. If you land in Iceland and you have some extra time, you can go to, quote, the Blue Lagoon, Blálaugin, which is an area where there's surplus water that's come out of a power plant, which has been developed into sort of a recreational area with highly silicious water. So you get kind of a silicious ooze in the bottom that you kind of squish between your toes. But it's rather pleasant with the snow flurries blowing by, and you're sitting there in 105 degree Fahrenheit water, letting the rest of the world worry. Iceland, from a geological standpoint, wait for Steve to, thank you. For some reason it's, thank you. When we look at Iceland, from a geological standpoint, it's actually being pulled apart, east and west. The very youngest rocks, volcanic rocks, are shown in these yellow zones here. The next oldest rocks are the red zones, and the oldest rocks, 15 million years old, are the bluish rocks. There have been a number of volcanic eruptions in the last, since the early 1960s, 1963, and in 1961 in Askja, Surtsey, 1963 to 1968, Hekla several times, 1970, 1945, many volcanic eruptions underneath Vatnajökull. So about, on the average, every 3 to 5 years, there's a volcanic eruption in Iceland. And then Heimaey here, which we'll show some slides of. I was here for the Surtsey eruption. I was here for the Heimaey eruption. That erupted in a community, a fishing community, and destroyed about a third of the community. We'll look at that in a moment. We have the pulling apart because Iceland sits on a plate boundary between the North American plate and the Eurasian plate. And so we have a pulling apart as the island's moving in this direction on this part and that way. So here we have the North American plate, and here we have the Eurasian plate. And it's moving apart at episodic intervals. But sometimes it can be quite, in the Krapla area, about 10 years ago, there were several rifting episodes where the ground was pulled apart. The Germans had been in there doing their very precise measurements, 0.001 millimeters of movement and what have you. Well, the movements got into the meter range. And so the Icelanders just dispensed with the fancy surveying and just called up the telephone company and asked them how many meters of wire they were adding between their telephone poles to make up for the pulling apart. And you could go up there and see where farmers' fences were 6, 9, 2 or 3 meters separated. So to keep the stock in the fields, they had to go and build new fences to fill in. When we look at the Earth, and I addressed this afternoon at another lecture, but when we look at the Earth conceptually, we can look at it in the context of the cryosphere, which is the frozen water fraction, the glaciers, the snow, the sea ice, permafrost, the hydrosphere, which is flowing water, the lithosphere, which is a dynamic solid Earth, volcanism, plate, tectonics, the atmosphere, the climatic processes, the biosphere, the living organisms, the 30 million or so that are on this planet, only of which about 5 million have been defined as individual species. And we have a number of different cycles, the hydrologic cycle, under biogeochemical cycles we have carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, phosphorus cycle, etc., which the whole planet functions as an integrated system, particularly the biosphere, the living Earth, and the inanimate Earth. So it's an extraordinary planet that we live on. And an example of volcanism, this was up in Krapla in the 1980s. This is where lava was spouting up through an opening in the lava flow and formed sort of a circular, just a aesthetically beautiful photograph taken by Sigurður Þórarinsson, Icelandic volcanologist. This is magma. Temperature about 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, 1080 Celsius. Rapidly cools, of course, and forms these clots in the air that fall back to the ground. Some of the volcanoes in Iceland, like Snæfellsnes, which you can see on a clear day from Reykjavik, about 70 kilometers or so to the northwest. You have the beautiful ice-capped volcano Snæfellsnes that I mentioned is the where Jules Verne's began the trip to the journey of the center of the earth. His famous novel was begun entering this crater here. Beautiful stratovolcano, the Fujiyama type shape, stratovolcano. We have evidence of the movement of the glaciers in the past. I've left my pen here to show you the scale. These are rocks that were deposited by a glacier that moved over this lava surface, and you can see it dragged the rocks along and made striations or scratches in the rock. And glaciologists use striations to show the direction of flow of the ice. In most places, when you see this, you don't see the agents that actually make the scratches. But in Iceland, it's like it happened yesterday. So it's magnificent to see these features. Iceland actually is misnamed. Actually, you could call Greenland Iceland and Iceland Greenland. In other words, it's a misnomer. I would call it Fossaland, or Foss for the Icelandic word for waterfall, because the land abounds in waterfalls. With the runoff from the glaciers, and they're just waterfalls everywhere. This is Skogafoss on the south coast, classic waterfall, just beautiful, coming over old lava flows, dropping in and then flowing out toward the North Atlantic. I'm just showing you sort of different parts in effect of the Earth system by using Iceland as an example. We also have a lot of wind erosion in Iceland, a very windy place. Here are some actually volcanic palagonite rocks that have been subjected to wind for long periods of time, and it essentially produces a natural sculpture, which is very, very nice. Also, even though Iceland is building out into the North Atlantic by its volcanic activity, it is also being eroded very rapidly by the ocean. And here we have the ocean pounding in on the south coast. This is Dyrhólaey, or Portland, which is an arch that's been cut in the local bedrock. And most of these cliffs just abound in seabirds. So those of you who are interested in bird watching, you can spend a lot of time in Iceland enjoying the different types of bird life. And one of my favorites, of course, is the puffin, which we'll see in a moment. Speaking of the bird, the puffin, maybe some of you are ornithologists, I've never figured out how they can catch these fish, these small fish, and they're all nicely lined up in their beaks. Always the tail in one direction, and they're just perfectly aligned. The puffin is really quite a beautiful bird, and it lives in burrows on the sides of hills. It actually burrows out, lays its eggs, raises its young. They don't look very good in terms of flying. They're kind of not very good flyers, it would seem, although they are, but they're beautifully adapted to using their wings like flippers in the water to catch fish. They have been reintroduced to Maine, along the Maine coast, by bringing in puffins and getting them reestablished on the Maine coast. So we have some now in the northeastern part of the United States. Nobody knows where they go, though, in the wintertime. They haven't figured out where they go. When they leave Iceland and migrate, they don't know where they end up. They probably end up in the middle of the ocean, so that's why you can't find them. Before moving into Iceland proper, I thought it'd be kind of fun just to show you, we talked a little bit about the different systems that make up the Earth, the frozen water, the liquid water, the solid rock, the biosphere, and the atmosphere. I want to show you some commonality, what we call analogs, terrestrial analogs on the planet that's the most closely associated with the Earth in terms of its features, and that is Mars. Mars is a major focal point of NASA exploration, orbiters, landers, although they didn't have too much luck in the last 5 years with some of their landers. But they have one in orbit right now that is doing a very good job of imaging the Earth, of the Martian surface, looking for water in particular. Mars is very similar to Earth. It has a very weak climate. You do see dust storms and what have you. It has a weak hydrologic cycle. It has solid earth. It has many volcanoes, as we will see. It does have ice caps in the present-day ice caps in the North and South Pole. And we know, which I'll show you evidence, that it had a lot more ice in the past. It has no liquid water, except apparently we're seeing some evidence of liquid water on some of the inner craters on the higher resolution images. But there's probably liquid water in the subsurface as you take the geothermal gradient. As the temperature goes up beneath the surface, it reaches a point where the ice would become water. We don't know that it has a biosphere, but I have a hunch is that, that life did evolve on Mars up to a certain point, probably prekaryotic organisms, or single-celled, non-nucleated organisms. And I think that we may find from exploration there fossils or maybe even remnants of the early development of life on Mars. This is Mars today. And one of the projects I'm working on is comparing the volcanoes of Mars and Iceland. Here we have the Tharsis volcanoes, the three. We're going to take a look at this one here. This is Olympus Mons, the largest volcano in the solar system. And then we have the valley that goes off in this direction, Mount Neris. And here's a color-enhanced version of what I just showed you, but on a two-dimensional. Here are the Tharsis volcanoes, the three of them lined up here. Olympus Mons, and then this great canyon that would stretch all the way across the United States in terms of area covered. Now here we have what looks like ground moraine. We have a crater here. We see what look like recessional moraines. This is not on Earth. This is not Iceland. This is Mars. This is on Tharsis Montes. This is one of the Tharsis volcanoes. This is actually Arsia Mons, one of the Tharsis volcanoes. And when I looked at this image, you could have sworn I was looking at Iceland. We had craters. This happens to be an impact crater, not a volcanic crater. But we see these what appear to be recessional moraines, sinuous moraines, what have you. So there must have been a lot more ice on Mars in the past. And here's an example in Iceland of exactly the same features that we were looking in the Martian surface. Here we actually still have an ice cap, but see these recessional moraines that show, and some have a sinuosity to them, very similar to what we see on Mars. Now we haven't gone to Mars yet, probably won't for another decade or more, but we can use Earth analogs and mentally make the jump that if these features are similar, they probably have a similar origin. We have these great fissures, grabens, and Gao, or tectonic fissures on Mars. We have the stratovolcano with the central crater. Remember we saw Snæfell's Nest with the ice cap on it. Take off the ice cap. These are volcanoes on the Martian surface that look every bit like those in Iceland. There's Skjaldbreidr in Iceland. We have a little bit of snow on it. We have the central crater. It has the same shape. It's a shield volcano, just like we saw on Mars. And so for those of you high school students, one of the areas I would go into if I were your age is go into astrogeology and to use these images, learn what you can about the Earth, and then try to apply your knowledge to, particularly to Mars. It's a wide open field. And we get these Gaus, just that we saw on the Martian surface. These have a little bit of snow in them, but these are tectonic fractures as the Earth's crust, in this case, is being pulled apart in Iceland. We get the separation of the lava flows with this pulling apart, the tearing apart. We see the same features on Mars. Now we're going to shift gears a little bit and take a look at what humans have done to Mars, to Iceland. We said that Iceland was settled in 874. There may in fact have been some Irish monks that arrived before that time, because there is an island in eastern Iceland off the coast called Papay, or Pope's Island. So there may have been monks there when the Icelanders came. They didn't hang around when the Norse arrived. They went elsewhere. One of the things that the Icelanders brought with them was the Icelandic horse, which is essentially unchanged since the settlement, more than 1,100 years ago now. In the wintertime, they develop a very, very thick coat. They look like something from the Ice Age. They're absolutely beautiful, and they're very small. They're bigger than a Shetland pony, but they're much smaller than a regular horse that we're used to, but they will carry an adult. And they're a lot of fun to ride, and they're very friendly. They're really very nice animals. They eat the grass, but they don't seem to damage it like these critters. These are very lovable lambs. They actually make very good eating. If you go to, well, as a matter of fact, in the old days, the Icelanders ate the first group of animals as well. But the sheep are extremely damaging to vegetation. Not only do they eat the grass, they pull it right up by the roots. So any part of Iceland that is not fenced will be essentially eaten by the sheep. If you want to see a forest regrowth, you've got to fence it and keep the sheep out, because in the summertime the sheep are free ranging, and they have been since settlement time. And the erosion has just been phenomenal from these animals. Here's an example of some of the erosion. We see the soil here, we see what's left, a cap of vegetation. The damage done by the overgrazing and then the wind and the harsh climate, it just does not recover very fast. And one of the reasons that Iceland has had a difficult time in terms of erosion and what have you, remember I said it was settled back here in 874. The early years of the settlement of the Icelandic Commonwealth was quite warm by comparison, and it was more like today, this century. It was very warm. Also, that is the period here when Greenland was settled. They had to weather up to this point in Greenland. They were doing fine, and then look at this deterioration of the climate. This is from the sea ice records. Thorvaldur Thorudsen, early part of the last century, went through and looked at sea captain sea ice records, how much sea ice they encountered in sailing to Iceland or from Iceland to the west. And he built up this sort of a, what you call a proxy record. He doesn't actually have a temperature measurement, but by the sea ice, by modern analogs, he can tell what the temperature must have been. So you can see it was quite warm during the settling of Greenland and also Iceland. Then you had this cold period, then you had a brief period of warmth again, and then it descended into what we refer to as the Little Ice Age, when it got considerably colder and worldwide the glaciers expanded. Iceland, everywhere. And then as the Little Ice Age ended, and remember the Little Ice Age is a natural variability of the climate cycle. This goes on, you get these warm and cool intervals that have nothing to do with humans. However, in this century, we're coming out of the Little Ice Age, and there is a suggestion from work that human alteration of the atmosphere and other changes that are occurring on the Earth's surface, deforestation, what have you, may be magnifying what is a natural warming interval that is following a cold period. But if you look at the geologic or any other record, you will see that you will get these periods of warm and cool that are natural variability. The question is, when are we going to go back into a cooler period, and will what humans are doing are going to enhance this warming interval, and will it prolong it? Since the settlement of Iceland, there have also been a number of volcanic eruptions. This was one of my Icelandic colleagues, volcanoes and lava, after we call it as a landnama, or the land naming. In other words, when they first settled. That's the word that's used in Icelandic for settlement. All of these orange and yellow areas you see are lava flows that have occurred since 874. Some of the ones I'll show you are Surtsey, Heimaey, Eldfelt was prehistoric. The largest lava flow, maybe 930 square kilometers, the largest lava flow in historic time anywhere on the planet occurred here at Laki in 1783, along a fissure eruption here that flowed out onto the south coast. So Icelanders, fortunately, most of the lava flows have occurred in the interior and well away from populated areas until the 20th century. But then again, the populated areas are expanding just like everywhere else in the world, and they are expanding into places that are more hazardous. This is a slide taken of the volcanic eruptions in northern Iceland in 1984 and around that period of time in the Krapla area. And this is a typical fissure eruption. It occurs all over the planet, where you get a long fissure opening up, like we saw on Mars, like we saw in Iceland. These are lava fountains that shoot up into the air many hundreds of feet, many tens of meters. And then you get these rivers of molten rock flowing away from the fissure and inundating the landscape in molten rock, which quickly solidifies. We also get submarine volcanic eruptions. This is Surtsey in 1963. This occurred in the Vestman Islands, the Irish Islands, off the south coast of Iceland. This is Surtsey probably in December of 1963 or late November. We have the lava erupting from a fissure, submarine, interacting with the seawater and getting these great columns, mostly of steam, but some of it is tephra or particularized lava that's being thrown into the atmosphere. The mainland of Iceland is back here. And here is an aerial photo looking down on what is a horseshoe shape. It's actually a crater that's forming. It is not completely circular because the pounding of the waves coming in from the south keeps breaching the wall of the crater, so you get a horseshoe-shaped form. And you have the central vent here with the steam rising from it. And this is loose material that has erupted, lava that's been particularized by the water interaction with water, forming this horseshoe shape. Also, as this material moves up into the atmosphere, you get a lot of electrical charge generating, and so very frequently in volcanic eruptions you'll have extraordinary displays of lightning. So you have other atmospheric phenomena associated with the eruption. A photograph I took in 1967, 1967, looking across Yolnir, and a new volcanic eruption occurring in, this was that old horseshoe shape right here, which has lava that's built up, so it now has some permanence to the island. There was another crater that formed over here, but this is a new eruption that's occurring. Right when we began our surveys, a volcanic eruption began. Good timing. This is Yolnir. It formed on Christmas Day, hence the name Yolnir, or Yule. It only lasted about a month before it was washed away. This was in the late, around 1990. You can see that the roundish island is now being truncated on the south, and a peninsula is building out to the north from the eroded material. And here is that first horseshoe that we saw in the early stages. Another one formed here. There's a central crater here. And the eruptions that we saw a few minutes ago formed right along in a line right here. Then 10 years later, lady woke up one morning, probably to go to the loo, looked out the window, saw the fire, called the fire department, and said, "Fire, fire," in Icelandic. "You must do something." The fireman checked it out and said, "Lady, there's nothing we can do. That's a volcanic eruption in your backyard." So in the space of a few days, they managed to evacuate 5,300 people from this island by air and by ship because, you know, for protective purposes. The chance of it exploding was very remote, but there was a lot of lava pouring into the town. And eventually the lavas would pour all the way over to here, near this fish packing plant, almost reach the hospital here, and inundate a good part of the eastern part of the village of Heimaey. This is probably Iceland's most important village after Reykjavik, or town, because it represents about 25% of the Icelanders' export earnings because of fisheries off this island. This is the main fishing port. And the principal concern was that these flows would fill in the harbor and make it unusable. And you can see here's a 3-story house, of which only the upper story is visible. The bottom two is completely covered with tephra, or airborne volcanic material that's rained down on it like snow. The volcano is in the background here, still steaming, and you can see these when I took this picture, this house was almost completely buried. And then some houses were particularly unlucky. This is a house that was completely surrounded by molten lava and essentially made part of the lava flow. Now, the Icelanders' response to this catastrophe, as far as the people were concerned there, was that when this house was destroyed, the bank still expected to receive its mortgage payment. But the insurance company, in the fine print, it said, you know, acts of God not covered. So they were in a bit of a bind. They still had to kind of shell out for the mortgage because the banks are unyielding. So the Icelandic parliament, which represented the will of the people, compensated everybody that lost everything here for the value of their house and their belongings. So at least they could get back to square one and rebuild their lives. And many of them lived in temporary housing on the mainland until they could move back into new housing on Heimaey. But I thought it was a very interesting response of a society. Same thing happens to a farmer whose sheep are wiped out by fluorosis poisoning from a volcanic eruption. One lost 7,000 head of sheep. And the farmer was compensated by the people of Iceland so that at least you don't lose anything, you start over again. This is Vatnajökull, which is Iceland's largest ice cap. It has many evidence of volcanic activity underneath the ice, which we'll look at for a moment. We'll look at this area up here, Kverkfjall, which has quite a bit of geothermal activity underneath the ice. We have a number of outlet glaciers that come down from the central part of the ice cap, and it also historically, and even as recently as 1996, have had tremendous glacial outburst floods, sometimes 3 and 4 times the size of the Mississippi River in terms of discharge. So we're talking about floods of almost unimaginable size. The last one I visited after the event occurred, there were blocks of ice as big as this room sitting out here on the outwash plain, which had been rafted away at the margin of the ice and then deposited out on the outwash plain between the glacier and the ocean. And then some of the ice margin lakes, such as Jökulsárlón, which is on the east side of Vatnajökull. This was, for those of you who are James Bond enthusiasts, this lake was used at the introduction of one of the James Bond movies, where he was being chased by the bad guys and shot out in here on his skis and ended up on one of these ice floes, which turned out to be, of course, a submarine. So it was shot here at this lagoon. This is the Grímsvatn caldera, which is a big subglacier caldera filled with ice and snow. There's meltwater underneath here from geothermal activity and volcanic activity. I think the next slide will show a volcanic eruption occurring right here. Yep, that's on the edge of the cliff there. You have a volcanic eruption occurring underneath the ice, punching up through the ice cover, and then forming a lot of water underneath here, and eventually this whole area will uplift and the water will escape and shoot out down onto the coastal plain. This is an expedition I was on in 1974. You can see the avalanches that have come down from some of these steep cliffs. Now we can see that that volcanic eruption occurred just off the screen to the right here at the edge of this cliff. A few years ago, an Icelandic geophysicist and an American were up here working in kind of fog and drove their mobile, something like this, right off the top. But they hit in such a way, it was sort of like a ski jumper. They hit sort of with the slope, with the right angle and everything. They both survived. The vehicle was not in very good shape. I don't think it was reusable. They survived, and it's a miracle, thinking of coming off that. It's scary enough just standing up on the top here and looking out. This is the area in northern Vatnajökull. We're talking about land of fire and ice. The glacier's trying to move forward this way, and then you have this huge geothermal area here, Paravetlir, or Warm Spring Valley. You can see all the steaming ground from the geothermal activity. All of this is steam. There are some snow patches here, the glaciers behind me. Just a spectacular sight. This was a thermal infrared image I acquired back in 1968. We can see that valley we were just looking at was right here. You can see all the thermal emission, the bright white you see here. There's a small lake here with geothermal activity. I visited this geothermal area here. Here's the glacier flowing down through this opening in the mountains, and then it ends down here. You can see hot water coming out of the snout of the glacier. You expect cold water to come out of a snout of a glacier, not hot water. This is a great place to camp because you got hot and cold running water right next to your campsite. We see these features of very great dimensions. This is probably 2 kilometers across, almost a mile across, where the geothermal or volcanic activity at the base of the ice is melting cavities, and you get this concentric collapse down at the surface. So you know what's going on underneath. You can't see it, but you know the evidence of it. Occasionally, though, it does make it through. And here's a volcanic eruption at Bartherbunga in 1996, which punched through the ice cap and began to form a valley which was ice-free. After the eruption ended, the glacier just flowed in and covered it all up. And when you go there now, you never would have known there was an eruption. It heals very quickly. This was the beginning of the Eucaloid in 1996 as it came out of Skeiðarárjökull. Here's one of the bridges across Skeiðarársandur. The amount of water I told you was just phenomenal. This bridge didn't last very long, was swept away by the flood. You can see one pier left here, the broken end here. You can see the end of one of the abutments, the road engineers trying to figure out what to do next. What they eventually did, and very quickly, was to put in new abutments, pour the concrete, much stronger, much bigger, and put this road back together at a very, very fast rate. Within a couple of months, that road was back in service. Here are some of those blocks I was telling you about. There's a small helicopter here in the foreground looking back toward the glacier, and just enormous blocks. Like I said, some of them are bigger than this room that were rafted out there. So it's really something to go out there and walk around these blocks and have them towering over you. And then just like the glacier scratching with the rocks that are also in the softer sediment, you had some of these large blocks just making scour marks across the softer sediment as they were pushed across by the great floodwaters. I told you about Iceland abounds in high temperature and low temperature geothermal areas, and the Icelanders have been particularly effective in tapping this energy source, primarily for space heating for their buildings, so they're detaching themselves from OPEC. They're also, they have an enormous hothouse industry where they're growing fresh vegetables. My wife and I, when we first went up there, it was hard to find things. But now when you go into the grocery stores or into restaurants and everything, you have fresh tomatoes, lettuce, cucumbers, all grown there in hothouses. And it doesn't matter what the season. They have copious amounts of hydroelectric power. So you have these villages or towns that are just acres and acres or hectares and hectares of hothouses growing food. And also flowers. Icelanders love flowers. And then you have swimming pools everywhere. Hot water and hot tubs, large hot tubs at the swimming pools too. And individuals can build swimming pools or what have you at a very nominal cost because the water is almost free. So all within the volcanic zone and even outside, there's plenty of hot water. And here's one of the sites that we visited the last time I was up there. This is just outside of Reykjavik. It's the Nesfellsfjall geothermal power plant and geothermal heating system. Some power is produced here, but most of it is for space heating. Most of these aqueducts that are going to Reykjavik are hot water for space heating. Just to give you an idea, the last couple of slides about Iceland, we're talking about an area as large as Virginia. Only 1% of the whole landscape is actually cultivated. About 20% is grazing land, primarily for sheep. The cultivated includes the home fields where they fertilize the grass. Look at glaciers, makes up 11 to 12%. Lakes, sand, barren sands, lava, 11%, almost the same as glaciers. And more than 50% is basically wasteland, lava flows and desert areas in Iceland. So they don't have much to work with, but they certainly have done a phenomenal job with what they do have as a society. And one of the things that they're doing, which is really quite remarkable for people that have been in Iceland maybe 40 years ago, 30 or 40 years ago, and to look at this was about a 40-year interval. This is a valley in Iceland. You can see the home fields and the farmstead, and you can see the forests that are now growing up as over that period of time. It is really remarkable to go to Iceland now and compare it with the past in terms of the forests that are being regenerated. In other words, the Icelanders are trying to put back the damage that was done very quickly by the early settlers and reforest and revegetate the land. And the other thing the Icelanders are doing, which is, again, exemplary, is that they are setting aside very large tracts of land here in the north, the Mývatn area, Skaftafell National Park, Landmannalaugar area. All these green areas you see are national parks, or areas that are preserves. And then there's just dozens and dozens of other sites that are historic interest, archaeological interest, botanical interest, special geology. They've really very carefully canvassing the landscape with the local people and what have you, and trying to set aside for posterity some of the most special parts of Iceland and turn them into places as national parks or just places that must be preserved. Not to be quarried for road metal, but to be preserved for posterity. And so for those of you who are interested, those who haven't been to Iceland, I heartily encourage you to go there and see some of these sites for yourself. Since it is a very small country, it's very easy to get out into the countryside. Horseback riding, simple, easy to do. Hiking trails, it's a marvelous land. And the people have been there for 1,100 years and are quite cordial. And also you might even learn some Icelandic, which after all is one of the parent languages of English. That's the last one. Thank you. Dr. Williams will take some questions from the audience. Thank you. Yes?
Have any kind of a road system for cars like we have here? Not like we have.
Yeah, well, 40 years ago, I would say no, that's not so good. Now, the question is, what about the road system in Iceland? Iceland has been very aggressively putting in really good road system. What used to take a half a day to get somewhere, you can now get there in an hour. There's a ring road that goes all the way around Iceland, and it's mostly paved now. And in the summertime, most of the boarding schools in the rural areas, the high schools and the middle schools are boarding schools because they collect the kids from the rural areas to go to school there, and then they go home on the weekends. In other words, they don't bus them every day because it's too far. Those become hotel eddas during the summertime, and the kids will often help staff them. So they're very nice places. They're Spartan. I mean, the sleeping is good, and you have the nice sign or the comforter to stay warm. The food is excellent, and they're all around the periphery. So for people that are really interested in the outside and seeing Iceland, that's really a good way to go. You can rent a car and drive all the way around and see all of Iceland. In the interior, you really need a four-wheel drive vehicle, and it's also preferable to go in two cars for safety purposes, because you often are fording streams and rivers, and there the roads are mostly gravel, and so one has to be a little more cautious. You can do have expedition vehicles, buses and things like that that will take you in at a nominal. You know, you can arrange it as a tourist thing. And they have these high buses with four-wheel drive that will go to places. That's probably a better way to go unless you're used to that kind of traveling by yourself. Yes?
Do they have any seasons there?
Do they have any seasons? Oh, yes. Sometimes they'll have all 4 seasons in one day. The seasons are, Reykjavik, I have only once seen it above 60 degrees Fahrenheit. It's a peninsula sticking out into Faxafloy. In the wintertime, it gets down in the low 30s. It's more like Boston weather in the wintertime, often has a lot of snow, or maybe it doesn't have much snow. It's a maritime climate along the coast, so you don't have the seasonal extremes. What you do have, and what really gets to you, is you're very far north, almost to the Arctic Circle. So in the summertime, the sun's up almost all the time. And when it slips below the horizon, it's like an hour or two, and then it's back up again. So you have an extraordinarily long periods of daylight. And so when I'm working there in the summer, you know, you'll go from 6 o'clock in the morning till 10 o'clock at night. You don't even really feel tired. You know, I mean, the way the lighting and the effect it had. Now, the reverse happens in December. I think I'd probably sleep all the time, because there you only have a couple hours of daylight, and the rest of it's dark. So the seasonality is not as pronounced. The summers, when you get in the inland, get a little more warm. And of course, the trees leaf out and everything. But it's really, it's the light and the dark that really characterizes Iceland. Yeah.
I was just wondering if there's any fish market there because of all the water, and maybe the warm water, they might be able to even grow shrimp.
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. He asked about fishing in Iceland. There's actually 2 types of fishing. One, they make a lot of money on fishermen that come there for salmon fishing. Iceland has probably some of the world's great salmon rivers. And if you're a real enthusiast, it costs you a lot of money too. We're talking $1,000 or more dollars. They give you like a kilometer or 2 of the river, and that's your kilometer that you can fish for a day or 2 or 3. And it's very popular for the well-to-do and for people that are real aficionados. They also are doing fish farming now. They're trying to grow salmon, just like they do in Norway, and other types of fish. But Iceland is probably best known for its fishing fleets and stern trawlers and fishing. There is, as Fred pointed out, there's a fish plant here, probably a distribution facility in Newport News or Norfolk. Newport News that brings in fish. The fish is superb. They don't leave it in the vessel very long. They usually fillet it quickly so you don't get blood pooling in the fish like many of our fishermen do. And then it's flash frozen. And so it maintains a very high quality, even if it's in a frozen form. And the Icelandic shrimp is like about a ½ inch long, very good. Various other types of fish, herring, but that kind of comes and goes in terms of fishing. Keiko, the killer whale, has been in a pen off the Vestman Islands for several years now. Doesn't seem to want to go into the wild. Seems to like humans taking care of it. I think that about does it on the fish. Yeah. Follow-up question?
One follow-up question. I know they've found oil off the Faroes, and I'm wondering if there's any exploration for crude oil around Iceland.
The Faroes is also volcanic, but it's possible on the ridge that extends toward the North Sea. You could get petroleum shows. Some years ago, I was asked by the Icelandic ambassador in Washington to take a look at Jan Mayen. Jan Mayen has a volcano in the north, Berenberg volcano, ice-capped, but the southern part of Jan Mayen, by the way, is an island just north of Iceland. The southern part of it is continental rocks that have been rafted away from Greenland. And there was a show of petroleum there, but it's in such deep water it's not economic. To my knowledge, nothing's ever been found around Iceland, and since it's very volcanic, and the mid-Atlantic ridge and everything, it's very unlikely. It's possible to the east as you head toward the Faroe Islands, because you're on that same ridge. I suppose it's possible. But it's interesting, the Icelanders' approach to that problem. I mean, they're stuck like the rest of us with the OPEC oil, but they're trying to detach themselves from it. And one way they're really experimenting with right now is to use their surplus electrical power from their hydro generating plants that services the aluminum industry and the ferrosilicon and what have you. It supplies to all the population. I mean, there's electricity, you know, just large quantities of electricity, is to disassociate water into hydrogen and oxygen. Use that power. Because in effect it's a surplus. So why don't we convert it to a different form and convert to a hydrogen economy? Let's run our cars, our buses, our trucks, and even our fishing fleet on hydrogen and detach from oil, except for lubricants and what have you. So there is work going on right now to do just that in Iceland, to see if they can put together a hydrogen fuel economy.
Is it true that the land area of Iceland is expanding?
Yes.
You mentioned in the beginning.
Yes, it is expanding. It's pulling apart. It is, over time. That's correct.
The land area is increasing.
It is increasing, but of course it's eroding away too with the ocean beating at the shores. So yes, it is expanding, but it's also eroding, right?
Well, I think we have a lot to thank Dr. Williams for, and so does the Icelandic ambassador and the Icelandic Tourist Bureau. So I think we'd all like to take a trip to Iceland after hearing what we just did. Let's thank Dr. Williams one more time.